3 years ago, my father called my boss to report that I was stealing from the company. What he didn't know was that my boss was my son Marcus, and we'd been planning this exact moment for 18 months. See, sometimes the only way to catch a snake is to let it think it's already won. My father thought he was destroying my career to steal my inheritance. Instead, he walked right into the most expensive confession of his life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It started on a Tuesday morning in January when Denver was locked under one of those gray winter skies that makes everything feel muted and heavy. I was sitting in my home office in Capitol Hill, reviewing quarterly reports for Hayes & Associates Financial Services, when my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Just 2 words. It's happening. I set down my coffee mug, a ceramic piece with a chip on the handle that I'd kept from my grandmother Eleanor's kitchen, and felt my pulse quicken. After months of careful planning, my father was finally making his move. The irony wasn't lost on me that the company bearing our family name would become the stage for exposing the man who'd spent decades manipulating that same name for his own gain. The Hayes family had built their fortune in Denver real estate development, starting with my great-grandfather who'd bought up land in what would become the downtown financial district. By the time I was born, we owned buildings that stretched across 3 city blocks, and my father, Robert Hayes, wore that legacy like a crown. He'd always made it clear that the family wealth would pass to the firstborn son, which meant my brother Daniel would inherit everything, while I'd get whatever scraps remained after legal fees and taxes. What my father never understood was that I'd stopped caring about his money years ago. What I cared about was justice. The morning felt ordinary enough as I walked the 6 blocks from my townhouse to our offices on 17th Street. Denver's financial district buzzed with its usual energy, men and women in wool coats hurrying between glass towers, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. I'd made this walk for 3 years now, ever since Marcus had convinced me to leave my position at a rival firm and join him at Hayes & Associates. Marcus had started the company fresh out of business school, using a small loan from me and his own savings. At 28, he'd already proven himself smarter and more ethical than anyone in my father's generation, building a client base through genuine expertise rather than inherited connections. When he'd offered me the position as senior financial advisor, I'd hesitate, not because I doubted his abilities, but because I knew my father would see it as a betrayal. Robert Hayes had his own investment firm, Summit Investment Group, which he'd run with the kind of old-school networking that relied more on golf course handshakes than actual return. For years, he'd expected me to join him there after college, to play the dutiful daughter who'd help him maintain his reputation while quietly handling the real work. When I'd chosen to build my own career path instead, he'd never quite forgiven the slide. The elevator ride to the 15th floor gave me time to center myself. Today wasn't just another day at work. Today was the culmination of a plan that had started when Lucas, my partner of 4 years, had accidentally overheard a phone conversation that changed everything. Lucas worked as a forensic accountant for a firm that specialized in white-collar crime investigations. 6 months ago, he'd been having lunch at a restaurant in Lakewood when he'd spotted my father at a corner table, speaking in hushed tones with a man Lucas recognized from financial fraud cases. The conversation had been quiet, but Lucas had caught enough fragments to understand that my father was discussing ways to access funds that weren't legally his. When Lucas had told me what he'd heard, the pieces of a puzzle I'd been unconsciously assembling for years suddenly clicked into place. My father's lifestyle had always seemed to exceed his legitimate income. The renovations to the family house, the expensive vacations, the luxury car purchases, none of it quite matched what Summit Investment Group's books should have supported. I'd assumed he was just good at managing his investments, but Lucas's observations suggested something darker. That night I'd called Marcus and asked him to meet me at Altitude Brew, a coffee shop near the University of Denver campus, where we were unlikely to run into anyone from our professional circle. Over steaming cups of coffee and the gentle hum of college students studying for finals, I'd shared what Lucas had discovered. Marcus had listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I'd finished, he'd been quiet for a long moment before asking the question that would reshape everything. What if we could prove it? The plan we'd developed was intricate and required patience. Marcus would hire a discreet investigation firm to look into my father's financial activities, while I would begin documenting every interaction I had with him, every comment he made about money or business. We'd create a paper trail that would either prove our suspicions or put them to rest definitively. What we'd discovered over the following months was worse than I'd imagined. My father hadn't just been skimming from his own client. He'd been systematically draining accounts belonging to elderly investors who trusted him to manage their retirement funds. The amounts weren't large enough to trigger immediate attention, but over time, they'd added up to nearly $2 million in stolen money. The most painful revelation was that he'd been using my grandmother Eleanor's name and memory to gain the trust of his victims. Eleanor had been beloved in Denver's older community, known for her charitable work and genuine kindness. My father had been telling potential clients that he was carrying on her legacy of caring for Denver's seniors, all while robbing them blind. Marcus and I had spent weeks debating how to expose this without destroying innocent people's lives in the process. Many of my father's victims didn't even realize they'd been robbed. Their monthly statements showed steady, if modest, returns that matched what they'd been promised. They were living on fixed incomes, trusting that their nest eggs were safe and growing slowly but surely. The breakthrough had come when we'd realized that my father's plan involved more than just stealing from strangers. He was positioning himself to claim legal control over the family trust that my grandmother had established, a fund worth nearly $5 million that was supposed to be distributed equally among her grandchildren, when the youngest, my cousin Emma, turned 30 next year. My father had been telling family members that I was financially irresponsible, that I'd made poor career choices and couldn't be trusted with significant money. He'd been building a case to have me declared an unfit beneficiary, which would allow him to redirect my portion of the inheritance to Daniel, who would then share it with him under the table. The beauty of our plan was its simplicity. We would let my father think he was succeeding in his campaign to destroy my reputation. Marcus would play the role of the concerned boss who was discovering discrepancies in company accounts. I would appear to be the guilty party, caught stealing from clients in a pattern that mirrored exactly what my father had been doing with his own firm. Of course, we weren't actually stealing anything. Marcus had created a series of dummy accounts using fictional client names, and we'd moved money between these accounts and legitimate business expenses in ways that would look suspicious to someone examining the books without context. Every transaction was documented and reversible, but on the surface it would appear that I was embezzling funds to support a lifestyle I couldn't afford. The trap was set when Marcus had casually mentioned to my father during a family dinner that he was concerned about some irregularities in the Hayes & Associates book. He'd played it perfectly, expressing worry about his company's reputation, while hinting that he suspected someone with access to client accounts was moving money inappropriately. My father had taken the bait immediately. Within days he'd been calling Marcus to express his own concerns about my character, sharing stories about my supposed financial irresponsibility, and suggesting that Marcus should look more closely at my access to company funds. Each conversation had been recorded with Marcus's consent, building a library of evidence that showed my father's eagerness to destroy my reputation for his own gain. The morning of the confrontation, I'd arrived at the office to find Marcus pacing in his corner office, his usually calm demeanor replaced by nervous energy. He'd been handling the pressure of our plan better than I'd expected, but the weight of what we were about to do was finally showing. "You sure about this?" he'd asked as I'd settled into the chair across from his desk. "Once we trigger this, there's no going back," I'd nodded, thinking about my grandmother Eleanor and the elderly clients whose trust my father had violated. "He's not going to stop on his own. This is the only way to protect everyone he's hurting." Marcus had picked up his phone and dialed my father's number. When Robert Hayes had answered, Marcus had delivered the lines we'd rehearsed. "Miss Hayes, I need to speak with you about a serious matter involving Victoria and some discrepancies in our accounts. Can you come in this afternoon?" My father's response had been immediate and telling. Instead of asking for details or expressing surprise, he'd said, "I was wondering when this would come to light. I'll be there in an hour." That response alone had been enough to confirm our suspicion. My father hadn't been surprised by the accusation, because he'd been expecting it, preparing for it, perhaps even hoping for it. The hour between that phone call and my father's arrival had felt like the longest 60 minutes of my life. Marcus and I had reviewed our evidence one final time, making sure every document was in order, every recording was accessible, every piece of our counterstrike was ready to deploy. When my father had walked into Marcus's office that afternoon, he'd carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he was about to win a game he'd been playing for months. He'd been dressed in his usual expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression a careful mask of concern mixed with disappointment. "Marcus," he'd said, shaking my son's hand with the firm grip of someone sealing a deal, "I appreciate you calling me about this situation. I know this must be difficult for you, having to confront family about such serious allegations." Marcus had gestured for him to sit, then had taken his place behind his desk. "Before we begin, Hayes, I want you to know that Victoria is aware of this meeting and has agreed to be present for the discussion." My father's mask had slipped slightly at that news. He'd clearly expected to have this conversation without me in the room, to be able to shape the narrative without having to face me directly, but he'd recovered quickly, nodding as if this was perfectly reasonable. "Of course," he'd said, "this affects her directly. She should be here to answer for her actions." That phrase, "answer for her actions," had been delivered with such certainty that it had taken all my self-control not to reveal our hand immediately. My father truly believed that he was about to watch me be destroyed by accusations of theft, accusations that he'd been carefully nurturing and amplifying for months. When I'd entered the office and taken my seat, my father had looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but something closer to satisfaction. He'd been looking forward to this moment, anticipating the fall of a daughter who'd never quite fit into his vision of what the Hayes family should be. Marcus had opened a folder on his desk and had pulled out several sheets of paper. "Mr. Hayes, over the past few weeks, our accounting department has identified a pattern of irregular transactions that appear to be connected to Victoria's access to client accounts." My father had leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. "What kind of irregularity?" "Transfers that don't match our standard procedures, adjustments to account balances that lack proper documentation, several instances where money was moved and then moved again in ways that make it difficult to track." Marcus had delivered each detail with convincing concern, playing his role perfectly. My father had nodded gravely. "I'm afraid I can't say I'm entirely surprised to hear this. Victoria has always struggled with financial boundaries." That comment had stung, even though I'd been expecting it. This was my father, the man who'd raised me, who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework, sitting in my son's office and lying about my character to destroy my life. Marcus had continued with the charade, showing my father fabricated evidence of my supposed crimes, walking him through a narrative that painted me as a desperate woman who'd been slowly stealing from clients to maintain a lifestyle I couldn't afford. With each detail, my father had become more animated, more eager to contribute his own observations about my supposed moral failings. "I've been worried about this for months," my father had said at one point. "Victoria has always been envious of her brother's success, always felt entitled to more than she'd earned. When she took this job, I wondered if she might be tempted to take shortcuts." The conversation had continued for nearly an hour, with my father providing what he believed was damning testimony about my character and history. He'd painted a picture of a jealous, irresponsible daughter who'd finally crossed a line from which there could be no return. Finally, Marcus had delivered the line that would spring our trap. "Mr. Hayes, given the severity of these allegations and your insights into Victoria's character, I think we need to involve law enforcement. Would you be willing to make a formal statement about what you've observed?" My father's eyes had lit up with an eagerness that had made my stomach turn. "Absolutely. I think that's the responsible thing to do. The integrity of your business and the safety of your clients have to come first, even when family is involved." That was the moment when Marcus had reached into his desk drawer and had pulled out a digital recorder that had been running throughout the entire conversation. "Hayes," Marcus had said, his voice taking on a completely different tone, "I need you to understand that everything you've just said has been recorded. You've just provided detailed testimony about crimes that you believe Victoria has committed, crimes that you've been anticipating and hoping to expose for months. My father's confident expression had begun to falter as the implications of Marcus's words had sunk in. Marcus had continued, "The problem is, none of the crimes you've described actually happened. Every transaction you've just heard about was fabricated. Every account irregularity was staged. Victoria hasn't stolen a single penny from any client." The color had begun to drain from my father's face as he'd realized that he'd walked into a trap. "What you have done," Marcus had said, pulling out a much thicker folder, "is demonstrate your intimate knowledge of financial fraud techniques, your eagerness to destroy Victoria's reputation, and your willingness to cooperate with law enforcement when you believe a crime has been committed." I'd finally spoken up, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Dad, we know about the money you've been taking from your elderly clients. We know about the fake returns you've been showing them while you've been draining their account. We know about your plan to manipulate Grandma Eleanor's trust to steal my inheritance." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My father had sat in stunned silence as the reality of his situation had become clear. Marcus had opened the thick folder and had begun laying out documents on his desk: bank statements, recorded phone calls, transaction records, testimony from victims who'd agreed to cooperate with our investigation. "We've been building this case for 8 months, Mr. Hayes. We have documentation of every theft, every forged document, every lie you've told to cover your tracks." The evidence had been overwhelming. Not only had we proven my father's crimes, but we'd also demonstrated his willingness to falsely accuse his own daughter of the same types of crimes he'd been committing. The recording of our meeting had captured him in the act of trying to destroy an innocent person's life to protect his own interests. My father had tried to deny everything at first, claiming that we'd misunderstood legitimate business practices, that we'd taken normal transactions out of context. But as Marcus had presented more evidence, his protest had become weaker and more desperate. The breaking point had come when I'd pulled out a letter that my grandmother Eleanor had written to me before her death, a letter that my father had never known existed. In it, she'd expressed her concerns about my father's financial practices and had specifically instructed that her trust be managed by an independent third party to prevent any family member from taking advantage of the others. "She knew," I'd said, holding the letter so my father could see her familiar handwriting. "Grandma Eleanor knew what kind of man you really were. She set up protections to keep you from stealing from your own family, just like you've been stealing from your client." That had been the moment when my father's carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled completely. The realization that his own mother had seen through his manipulations, that she'd died knowing he was capable of the crimes he'd been committing, had broken something fundamental in his ability to maintain his denial. The silence in that office had been deafening as my father had sat there, surrounded by evidence of his crimes, facing the son and daughter who'd outmaneuvered him completely. For the first time in my life, I'd seen my father look truly small, truly defeated. Marcus had reached for his phone. "Miss Hayes, I'm going to call Detective Amanda Rodriguez with the Denver Police Department's white-collar crime unit. She's been expecting our call." As Marcus had dialed the number, I'd looked at my father and had felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a deep sadness for the man he could have been if he'd chosen a different path. This was still my father, still the man who'd raised me. But he was also a criminal who'd been stealing from vulnerable people while trying to destroy his own daughter's life. The call to Detective Rodriguez had been brief. She'd already been briefed on our case and had been waiting for our signal to move forward with arrests. Within minutes, she'd confirmed that warrants had been issued and that officers were on their way to our office. My father had made one last attempt to salvage the situation, offering to make restitution to his victims if we'd agree to handle the matter privately. But the damage was too extensive, the crimes too serious, and the betrayal too personal for any private resolution. When the police had arrived, my father had been arrested on charges including elder fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy. As they'd led him away in handcuffs, he'd looked back at me with an expression that I'd never forget. Not anger, but genuine bewilderment, as if he couldn't understand how the daughter he'd underestimated had managed to bring down his entire carefully constructed world of lies. The weeks following my father's arrest felt like living in a strange alternate reality where everything looked the same but carried completely different weight. I'd wake up in my Capitol Hill townhouse to the same view of the mountains, drink coffee from the same chipped mug, walk the same route to work, but the world had fundamentally shifted beneath my feet. The local news had picked up the story within hours of Robert Hayes being led away in handcuffs. Prominent Denver investment advisor arrested in elder fraud scheme had been the headline that flashed across my phone screen as I'd sat in Marcus's office, still processing what we'd just accomplished. The article had been brief but devastating, mentioning the estimated $2 million in stolen funds and the dozens of elderly victims who'd trusted their retirement savings to a man who'd been systematically robbing them. What the news hadn't captured was the personal earthquake happening within our family. Within 24 hours of the arrest, my brother Daniel had called me for the first time in 6 months, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "What the hell have you done, Victoria?" he demanded without even a greeting. "Do you have any idea what this means for all of us?" I'd been standing in my kitchen, preparing dinner for Lucas and myself, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. The question had hit me like a physical blow, not because of its anger, but because of its complete lack of concern for our father's victims. "It means that Dad won't be able to steal from any more elderly people," I'd replied, my voice steadier than I'd felt. "It means that Miss Patterson down the street might actually have enough money for her medications next month." Daniel had made a sound of disgust. "Don't give me that self-righteous garbage. You've destroyed our family's reputation to settle some petty score. Do you know what this does to my law practice, to Mom's social standing, to the Hayes name in this city?" The conversation had continued for another 10 minutes. With Daniel alternating between accusations that I'd fabricated evidence against our father, and demands that I find a way to make the charges disappear. Not once had he asked whether the allegations were true. Not once had he expressed concern for the people our father had hurt. When I'd finally hung up, Lucas had wrapped his arms around me from behind, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of family chaos. "You did the right thing," he'd whispered against my hair. "Don't let him make you doubt that." But doubt had crept in anyway, especially during the long nights when sleep eluded me and I'd found myself replaying every interaction I'd ever had with my father, searching for signs of the man who could steal from vulnerable elderly people while maintaining the facade of a loving family patriarch. The discovery phase had been the hardest part. As more details of my father's crimes had emerged through the investigation, I'd realized that his betrayal had been even more extensive than we'd initially uncovered. He hadn't just been stealing from strangers, he'd been manipulating family friends, people who'd known me since childhood, leveraging his relationship with my grandmother Eleanor's memory to gain their trust. Miss Chen, who'd lived 3 houses down from us when I was growing up, and had always brought homemade dumplings to family gatherings, had lost nearly $40,000 of her retirement savings. Mr. Rodriguez, who'd taught me to change a tire when I was 16, had seen his modest investment account drained to cover my father's personal expenses. These weren't faceless victims. They were people who'd watched me grow up, who'd trusted my father partly because they'd known and loved our family. The guilt had been overwhelming. Even though I'd had no knowledge of my father's crimes, even though I'd been the one to expose them, I'd felt responsible for every dollar stolen, every trust betrayed. These people had been hurt by someone bearing my name, someone whose reputation had been built on associations with my grandmother's genuine kindness. Marcus had found me crying in my office one Thursday afternoon, surrounded by victim impact statements that Detective Rodriguez had shared with us. Each statement had been a knife to the heart, detailing not just financial losses, but the emotional devastation of learning that someone they'd trusted had been systematically betraying them. "You can't carry this," Marcus had said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "What he did reflects on him, not on you." I'd looked up at my son, this brilliant young man who'd risked his own business reputation to help me expose the truth, and had felt a fierce mixture of pride and protectiveness. But they trusted him because of our family name, because of what Grandma Eleanor built in this community. Marcus had leaned forward, his expression serious. "Then let's rebuild it the right way. Let's show them what the Hayes name can actually mean when it's attached to people with integrity." That conversation had planted the seed of an idea that would grow into something much larger than either of us had initially imagined. Over the following days, as we'd continued to deal with the legal fallout from my father's arrest, we'd begun discussing ways to make direct amends to his victims. The challenge had been complex. Many of the stolen funds had already been spent, used to finance my father's lifestyle or hidden in accounts that investigators were still working to locate. The traditional legal process would eventually provide some restitution, but it would take years and would likely recover only a fraction of what had been stolen. Lucas had been the one to suggest that we consider using my expected inheritance from Eleanor's trust to create an immediate victim compensation fund. The idea had initially felt overwhelming. That money represented my financial security, my children's college funds, my retirement plan. But the more I'd thought about it, the more right it had felt. "It's what she would have wanted," I'd told Lucas one evening as we'd walked through the snow-covered streets of Capitol Hill. "Grandma Eleanor spent her whole life taking care of people in this community. She would never want her money to sit in a trust while her neighbors suffered because of what her son did." The legal mechanics of accessing the trust funds had been complicated. Eleanor's will had specified that the money couldn't be distributed until the youngest grandchild turned 30, which wouldn't happen for another 10 months. But the will had also included provisions for emergency distributions in cases of family crisis, and our attorney, Catherine Bell, had argued successfully that our father's crimes constituted exactly such a crisis. The process had taken 3 months of court filings, family meetings, and negotiations with other beneficiaries. Daniel had fought the early distribution every step of the way, hiring his own attorney to argue that I was trying to steal the family money under the guise of victim compensation. My mother, Patricia, had remained silent throughout most of the proceedings, still processing the reality of her husband's crime. The breakthrough had come when my cousin Emma, the youngest beneficiary whose 30th birthday was the trust's maturation trigger, had voluntarily testified in favor of the early distribution. Emma had always been close to Eleanor, had spent summers helping her with community volunteer work, and had understood immediately that using the trust to help my father's victims was exactly what her grandmother would have wanted. "Nana Eleanor used to say that money was just a tool," Emma had told the probate judge. "She said its only value came from how you used it to help other people. I can't think of a better way to honor her memory than by using her money to fix the damage her son caused." The judge had approved the early distribution on a cold March morning, releasing $1 million from the trust to create the Eleanor Thompson Hayes Victim Compensation Fund. The remaining money would stay in trust until Emma's birthday, but this amount would be enough to provide full restitution to every one of my father's victims, plus additional support for counseling and financial planning service. The day we'd distributed the first compensation checks had been one of the most emotionally intense experiences of my life. We'd rented a community room at the Denver Public Library's Central Branch, the same building where my grandmother had volunteered for literacy programs for decades. One by one, my father's victims had come to receive their restitution checks, and to hear our apology on behalf of the Hayes family. Mrs. Chen had been among the first to arrive, moving slowly with her walker but with dignity and tact. When I'd handed her the check for $43,000, the full amount my father had stolen plus interest, she'd looked at it for a long moment, before looking up at me with tears in her eyes. "Your grandmother was a good woman," she'd said, her voice shaky with emotion. "I'm glad to see that goodness lives on in you." Similar scenes had played out throughout the afternoon. Mr. Rodriguez had broken down completely when he'd realized that his retirement savings had been fully restored. An elderly woman named Dorothy Miller, who'd lost money she'd been saving for her grandson's college tuition, had hugged me so tightly that I'd struggled to breathe. But perhaps the most powerful moment had come when Marcus had stood up to address the gathered group. He'd spoken about his great-grandmother Eleanor, about the values she'd instilled in our family, and about our commitment to ensuring that nothing like this would ever happen again. "The Hayes name used to mean something good in this community," he'd said, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "My great-great-grandmother built that reputation through decades of genuine service and care for her neighbors. My grandfather tarnished that legacy through his crimes, but we're here today to begin rebuilding it, the right way. He'd gone on to announce that Hayes and Associates would be establishing a permanent fund to provide free financial planning services to Denver's senior community, staffed by licensed professionals who would help elderly residents avoid financial fraud and manage their investments safely. The applause that had followed his announcement had been warm and sustained, but more importantly, I'd seen something shift in the faces of the people around us. They'd come into that room as victims, people who'd been betrayed and hurt by someone they'd trusted. They'd left as community members who'd been heard, validated, and made whole by people who shared the name of their betrayer. The local media had covered the compensation event extensively, with headlines like "Hayes family provides full restitution to fraud victims," and "Grandmother's trust used to heal community wounds." The coverage had been largely positive, focusing on our efforts to make amends rather than on the original crimes, but the real validation had come from the victims themselves. Over the following weeks, I'd received dozens of handwritten thank you notes, emails, and phone calls from people who'd been at that library gathering. They'd written about restored faith in human decency, about the relief of knowing they wouldn't have to choose between medications and meals, about their gratitude for being treated with respect and dignity during the restitution process. One letter had particularly stayed with me, written by a man named Frank Thompson, whose wife had been receiving treatment for Alzheimer's disease. My father had stolen nearly $60,000 from Frank's account, money that had been earmarked for his wife's care. In his letter, Frank had written, "What your father did nearly broke us, not just financially but spiritually. When you lose faith in people's basic decency, it changes how you see the world. But what you and your son did, the way you made this right, it reminded me that there are still people in this world who understand what family and community really mean. Your grandmother would be proud." Reading that letter, I'd finally understood that our plan had accomplished something much more important than just exposing my father's crimes, or protecting ourselves from his manipulations. We'd found a way to transform a story of betrayal and theft into a story of accountability and healing. The legal proceedings against my father had continued throughout this period, moving through the criminal justice system with the methodical pace of serious felony cases. Detective Rodriguez had kept us informed of the progress, explaining how our recorded conversations and documented evidence had made the prosecution's case essentially airtight. My father had initially pleaded not guilty, apparently hoping that his attorney could find some procedural error or evidentiary weakness that would allow him to escape consequences. But as the full scope of evidence had become clear during discovery, his legal strategy had shifted toward negotiating a plea deal that might minimize his prison sentence. The plea negotiations had been particularly difficult for me to navigate emotionally. Part of me had wanted my father to face the full consequences of his crimes, to be held accountable for every dollar stolen and every trust betrayed, but another part of me had still seen him as my father, had still felt some vestige of the love and loyalty that had once defined our relationship. Lucas had been invaluable during this period, helping me process the complex emotions that had come with watching my father's public downfall. He'd reminded me that feeling conflicted about my father's fate was normal and healthy, that I could simultaneously support his prosecution and mourn the loss of the relationship we'd once had.
"You're not betraying him by wanting justice," Lucas had said during one of our long evening walks through the Capitol Hill neighborhood. "And you're not betraying his victims by still loving the father you thought you knew." The final plea hearing had taken place on a rainy Thursday morning in May. My father had stood before Judge Maria Santos and had formally pleaded guilty to 14 counts of elder fraud, 6 counts of embezzlement, and 3 counts of money laundering. In exchange for his guilty plea, the prosecution had agreed to recommend a sentence of 8 to 12 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 70% of his sentence. I'd attended the hearing, sitting in the gallery with Marcus and Lucas, watching as the man who'd raised me had formally admitted to crimes that would define the remainder of his life. When the judge had asked if he understood the charges against him and the consequences of his plea, my father had answered in a voice so quiet that she'd had to ask him to repeat himself. The victim impact statements had been read during the sentencing phase 2 weeks later. Miss Chun had written about the sleepless nights she'd spent worrying about her financial security. Mr. Rodriguez had described the depression he'd fallen into after learning about the theft. Dorothy Miller had talked about having to tell her grandson that she could no longer help with his college expenses. But perhaps the most powerful statement had come from Frank Thompson, whose wife's Alzheimer's care had been threatened by my father's theft. Frank had attended the hearing in person, speaking directly to my father from the witness stand. "You didn't just steal money from us," Frank had said, his voice steady but filled with pain. "You stole our security, our peace of mind, our ability to trust people. My wife doesn't understand what happened to our savings, but I have to live every day knowing that someone we trusted betrayed us when we were most vulnerable." When Frank had finished speaking, I'd looked over at my father and had seen tears streaming down his face. For the first time since his arrest, he'd seemed to truly understand the human cost of his crimes, the real damage he'd done to people who'd trusted him. Judge Santos had sentenced my father to 10 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 7 years. She'd also ordered him to pay full restitution to his victims, though we'd already accomplished that through the trust fund distribution. As part of his sentence, he'd been permanently barred from working in any financial services capacity, and would be required to undergo psychological counseling to address the underlying issues that had led to his criminal behavior. The moment when my father had been led away to begin serving his sentence had felt both like an ending and a beginning. An ending to the family I'd thought I'd known, to the illusions I'd maintained about my father's character, to any possibility of reconciliation or forgiveness, but also a beginning to something new, something built on truth rather than manipulation, on accountability rather than denial. As Marcus and I had walked out of the courthouse that day, past the reporters and photographers documenting the conclusion of a case that had captured Denver's attention, I'd felt a strange sense of peace. We'd done what we'd set out to do. We'd exposed the truth, protected future victims, provided restitution to those who'd been hurt, and begun the process of rebuilding our family's reputation on a foundation of integrity rather than inherited privilege. But I'd also known that the hardest work was still ahead of us. Exposing my father's crimes and securing his conviction had been complex and emotionally draining, but it had also been relatively straightforward. The evidence had been clear, the legal system had functioned as designed, and justice had been served. Rebuilding trust, healing relationships, and creating something positive from the wreckage of my father's betrayal would be much more difficult and would require sustained effort over years rather than months. That evening, as Lucas and I had sat on our back porch watching the sun set over the Denver skyline, I'd reflected on how much had changed since that January morning, when Marcus had sent me the text message saying, "It's happening." In less than 6 months, we'd dismantled my father's criminal enterprise, compensated his victims, and begun the process of transforming our family legacy from one of exploitation to one of accountability. But we'd also lost something irreplaceable. The father I'd thought I'd known, the family relationships I'd believed were based on love and mutual respect, the sense of security that had come from believing my family was fundamentally good, all of that was gone forever. Lucas had reached over and taken my hand as we'd sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights begin to twinkle in the gathering darkness. "What are you thinking about?" he'd asked gently. I'd considered the question for a moment before answering. "I'm thinking about what comes next. We've proven that we can tear down something that was built on lies and theft. Now we need to prove that we can build something better in its place. The challenge would be living up to that commitment, day after day, choice after choice, until we'd created a new definition of what it meant to carry the Hayes name in Denver. It would require humility, consistency, and a willingness to be judged by our actions rather than our intention. But as I'd sat there with Lucas, thinking about Marcus and the ethical business he was building, about the victims who'd been made whole, about the community that had seen both the worst and best of human nature in our family's story, I'd felt optimistic about our chances of success. The foundation had been laid, the real building could begin. The rebuilding process had started almost immediately, though it had taken forms I'd never anticipated. Within a week of my father's sentencing, I'd received a call from Catherine Bell, our family attorney, informing me that several of my father's former clients wanted to transfer their accounts to Hayes & Associates. "They're impressed by how you handled the restitution process," Catherine had explained. They see Marcus's firm as representing the values they thought they were getting from your father's company. The irony hadn't been lost on me. My father had spent years building a client base through manipulation and false promises, only to lose it all when his crimes were exposed. Now Marcus was gaining clients specifically because he demonstrated the integrity and transparency that my father had only pretended to possess. But accepting these new clients had presented its own challenges. Marcus and I had spent hours discussing whether it was appropriate to benefit financially from the situation, even indirectly. We'd ultimately decided that serving these clients well would be the best way to honor both their trust and my grandmother Eleanor's memory. But we'd also established strict protocols to ensure that we never took advantage of the vulnerability they'd experienced. Every new client had received a comprehensive overview of our business practices, our fee structure, and their rights as investors. We'd required multiple meetings before accepting any accounts, giving people time to consider their decisions without pressure. Most importantly, we'd established an independent oversight board, including 2 retired financial professionals and a representative from Denver's Better Business Bureau, to review our practices and ensure that we maintained the highest ethical standards. The oversight board had been Marcus's idea, born from his understanding that rebuilding trust required more than just good intentions. It required transparent systems, external accountability, and a willingness to submit to scrutiny that went beyond what was legally required. People need to see that we're not just saying we're different, Marcus had explained during one of our planning meetings. They need to see concrete evidence that we've built safeguards to prevent what happened with Grandpa from ever happening again. The board had met monthly, reviewing our client communications, fee disclosures, investment strategies, and complaint resolution procedures. Their reports had been made public, posted on our website, and shared with any current or prospective client who requested them. The transparency had been unprecedented in Denver's financial services industry, but it had also been effective in rebuilding confidence in the Hayes name. Over the summer, our client base had grown steadily, not through aggressive marketing or family connections, but through word-of-mouth recommendations from people who'd been impressed by our commitment to transparency and ethical practice. Each new client had represented not just business growth, but a vote of confidence in our ability to be different from what my father had been. The personal healing had been more complicated and less linear than the business rebuild. My relationship with my mother, Patricia, had remained strained throughout my father's legal proceedings, with months passing between our brief, awkward phone conversation. She'd never explicitly blamed me for my father's imprisonment, but she'd also never acknowledged that exposing his crimes had been the right thing to do. The breakthrough in our relationship had come unexpectedly during a chance encounter at a grocery store in Lakewood in late July. I'd been shopping for ingredients for a dinner party when I'd spotted my mother in the produce section, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd remember. We'd stood there for an awkward moment, separated by a display of summer peaches, neither of us sure how to bridge the months of silence between us. Finally, my mother had spoken first. "You look well," she'd said, her voice carefully neutral. "So do you," I'd replied, though it hadn't been entirely true. My mother had looked tired, worn down by the stress of her husband's crimes and imprisonment, by the social isolation that had followed his conviction, by the complete upending of the life she'd thought she'd been living. We'd talked for a few minutes about mundane things, the weather, the quality of the produce, mutual acquaintances we'd encountered recently, but as we'd prepared to part ways, my mother had surprised me. "Victoria," she'd said, reaching out to touch my arm, "I want you to know that I understand why you did what you did. I don't like it, and I wish there had been another way, but I understand it." The acknowledgement had been limited, qualified, far from a full reconciliation. But it had also been the first time since my father's arrest that my mother had indicated any acceptance of my role in exposing his crimes. It had felt like the beginning of a possibility, the first step toward some form of rebuilt relationship. Our conversations had resumed gradually after that encounter, brief phone calls every few weeks that had slowly grown longer and more substantive. My mother had begun sharing details about her own process of coming to terms with my father's crimes, about the shock of learning that the man she'd been married to for 35 years had been living a completely double life. "I keep going through our old conversations," she'd told me during one of these calls, "looking for signs I should have noticed, things I should have questioned. But he was so good at making everything seem normal, so good at explaining away anything that didn't quite make sense." Her perspective had helped me understand something important about my father's crimes. He hadn't just stolen money from his victims, he'd stolen their reality, their ability to trust their own judgment about people and situations. The psychological damage had been as significant as the financial losses, and it had extended to everyone who'd believed they'd known him. My relationship with my brother Daniel had remained fractured, with no signs of potential healing. He'd continued to blame me for destroying our family's reputation, and had refused to acknowledge that our father's crimes were real rather than fabricated. During the few conversations we'd had, he'd maintained that I'd somehow manipulated the evidence, that our father had been the victim of an elaborate conspiracy designed to steal his business and reputation. The denial had been frustrating and painful, but I'd come to understand that Daniel's response was his way of protecting himself from a reality too devastating to accept. Admitting that our father was a criminal would have required him to re-examine every aspect of his relationship with the man he'd idolized, to question his own moral framework, to accept that the family legacy he'd expected to inherit was built on theft and betrayal. Marcus had struggled with his uncle's rejection as well, particularly because they'd once been close. Daniel had been present for Marcus's childhood milestones, had provided mentorship during his college years, had celebrated the launch of Hayes and Associates. But Daniel's inability to accept the truth about his father had poisoned those relationships as well. "It's like he'd rather believe that we're all lying than face the fact that Grandpa was a criminal," Marcus had said after a particularly painful conversation with Daniel. "I understand why it's hard for him, but I can't respect someone who chooses comfortable lies over difficult truths." The loss of Daniel's relationship had been one of the unexpected costs of our decision to expose my father's crime. We'd gained justice, closure, and the ability to rebuild our reputation honestly, but we'd also lost a significant portion of our family structure. Some prices were worth paying, but that didn't make them painless. As autumn had approached, bringing the one-year anniversary of Lucas's discovery of my father's suspicious restaurant conversation, I'd found myself reflecting on everything that had changed. We'd accomplished our original goals and more, but we'd also learned that seeking justice often meant accepting consequences that extended far beyond the immediate situation. The Hayes name in Denver now carried a complex legacy. It was associated with both significant criminal activity and comprehensive accountability, with both betrayal and redemption. People knew that a Hayes had stolen from vulnerable elderly victims, but they also knew that other members of the Hayes family had sacrificed their own inheritance to make those victims whole. It was a complicated reputation, but it was an honest one. And as I'd continued to receive thank you notes from my father's victims, as Marcus's business had grown through ethical practices and transparent operations, as our community oversight board had praised our commitment to accountability, I'd begun to believe that we were successfully redefining what our family name could represent. The work of rebuilding had been difficult, often painful, and far from complete, but it had also been meaningful in ways that I'd never anticipated when we'd first started planning our trap for my father. We'd learned that justice wasn't just about punishment for wrongdoing, it was also about creating systems and relationships that made future wrongdoing less likely. We'd discovered that accountability wasn't just about admitting mistakes, it was about taking concrete action to repair damage and prevent similar harm. We'd found that healing wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about truth-telling, boundary setting, and the patient work of rebuilding trust through consistent ethical behavior. As the leaves had begun to change color in the mountains surrounding Denver, painting the landscape in brilliant reds and golds, I'd felt a sense of cautious optimism about what we'd built from the wreckage of my father's crime. It wasn't the family I'd grown up in, and it wasn't the business legacy I'd once expected to inherit, but it was something better, a foundation built on truth rather than lies, on service rather than exploitation, on values that could withstand scrutiny, rather than manipulation that required secrecy. The real test would be could we maintain these standards, not just during the crisis period when everyone was watching, but during the ordinary moments when ethical choices were less dramatic but equally important. Could we resist the temptations that had corrupted my father, the gradual erosion of standards that had allowed him to rationalize stealing from people who trusted him? I'd believed we could, but I'd also understood that belief alone wouldn't be sufficient. It would require constant vigilance, ongoing accountability, and a willingness to submit to the oversight and feedback that would help us stay true to our commitments. The foundation was strong, but the building would be a lifelong project. And as I'd looked ahead to that work, I'd felt both the weight of responsibility and the satisfaction that came from knowing we were finally moving in the right direction. The turning point came on a crisp October morning, when Lucas answered a knock at our door to find Miss Chan standing on our porch, holding a covered casserole dish, and wearing the kind of determined expression that suggested she had something important to say. I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when I heard her voice, still accented with the Mandarin of her childhood, but strong and clear despite her 82 years. "I need to speak with Victoria," she announced, brushing past Lucas with the confidence of someone who had navigated far more challenging situations than an unexpected social call. "There are things that must be discussed." I emerged from the kitchen to find her settling herself onto our living room couch with the practiced ease of someone claiming her rightful place in the world. The casserole dish sat on our coffee table, steam escaping from beneath its aluminum foil covering, filling the room with the rich aroma of ginger and soy sauce. "Mrs. Sheehan," I began, uncertain about the purpose of her visit, but grateful to see her looking healthier than she had during the dark months following my father's arrest. "What brings you here this morning?" She looked at me with eyes that held decades of accumulated wisdom and no small amount of mischief. "Sit," she commanded, patting the cushion beside her. "We have work to do." The work, as it turned out, was nothing less than the complete transformation of how financial services were delivered to Denver's elderly community. Miss Chan had spent the months since receiving her restitution check talking with other seniors, listening to their stories of financial confusion and vulnerability, and developing ideas about how to protect people like herself from future exploitation. "Your father was not the only one," she explained, her voice taking on the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "There are others who prey on old people, who take advantage of our loneliness and our trust. The problem is not one bad man. The problem is a system that makes it easy for bad men to succeed." She opened a worn leather purse and pulled out a manila folder thick with handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be a detailed organizational chart. "I have been thinking about this every day since the trial ended. Thinking about how your grandmother Eleanor would have approached this problem." The folder contained the foundation of what would become the Eleanor Hayes Community Financial Protection Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to provide education, advocacy, and oversight services to Denver's senior population. Ms. Jeanette outlined everything from basic financial literacy classes to a peer counseling network that would help elderly residents identify and report potential fraud. "Your grandmother believed that community problems required community solutions." Ms. Chan continued, spreading her notes across our coffee table with the precision of a general planning a campaign. "She would not have been content to help just the people your father hurt. She would have wanted to protect everyone who might be hurt in the future." The scope of her vision was breathtaking. She proposed establishing a network of volunteer financial advocates, trained seniors who would accompany their peers to important financial meetings and help them understand complex documents. She envisioned educational workshops held in community centers, libraries, and senior housing facilities, teaching people to recognize the warning signs of financial abuse and exploitation. Most ambitiously, she wanted to create a formal oversight system that would monitor financial services providers serving the elderly community, maintaining databases of complaints and conducting regular audits to identify patterns of suspicious activity before they could cause widespread harm. "This cannot be done by one person or one family," she acknowledged, looking directly at me. "But it can be started by people who understand what we are trying to prevent." Lucas had been listening from the kitchen doorway, and I saw him nod approvingly as Mrs. Chen outlined her plan. His background in forensic accounting had given him deep insight into how financial fraud typically operated, and I could see him mentally cataloging the ways her proposed safeguards could disrupt those patterns. The infrastructure exists, he said, joining us in the living room, the senior centers, the volunteer networks, the legal aid organizations. What's missing is coordination and funding. Mrs. Chen smiled at him with the warmth of someone recognizing a kindred spirit. Exactly. And we have something that most community initiatives do not have. We have a powerful story that people will remember. She was right. The story of my father's crimes and our family's response had captured public attention in a way that made people receptive to broader conversations about elder financial protection. The media coverage had raised awareness about the vulnerability of elderly investors, and the restitution process had demonstrated that accountability was possible even after serious harm had been done. People are paying attention right now, Mrs. Chen continued. They are thinking about these problems in ways they were not thinking about them before your father was arrested. This is our opportunity to channel that attention into something constructive. Over the following weeks, Ms. Chen became a regular presence in our lives, arriving most mornings with new ideas, additional research, and an expanding network of seniors who wanted to be involved in the initiative. She had recruited Mrs. Patterson from down the street, Ms. Rodriguez from our old neighborhood, Dorothy Miller, whose grandson's college fund had been restored, and dozens of other seniors who had either been directly affected by financial fraud or were concerned about protecting their communities from future exploitation. The first formal meeting of what would become known as the Eleanor Hayes Initiative took place in the community room of the Montclair Recreation Center on a snowy November afternoon. I had expected perhaps a dozen attendees, but more than 40 seniors filled the room, along with representatives from the Denver Department of Aging, the Better Business Bureau, and several local financial institutions that wanted to demonstrate their commitment to ethical practices. Marcus had prepared a presentation outlining the technical aspects of financial fraud prevention, but it was Mrs. Chen who set the tone for the gathering with an opening speech that was both deeply personal and surprisingly political. "We are here because we refuse to be victims," she announced, standing at the front of the room with the commanding presence of someone who had survived both the Cultural Revolution in China and decades of American bureaucracy. "We are here because we understand that individual solutions to community problems are not enough." She went on to describe her own experience with my father's theft, but she framed it not as a personal tragedy but as a symptom of larger systemic failure. "The man who stole from me was able to do so because our society teaches old people to be polite, to trust authority figures, to avoid making trouble. He was able to do so because our financial system is complicated and secretive, designed to benefit professionals rather than clients." The room was completely silent as she spoke, 60 and 70 and 80-year-old faces focused intently on her words. These were people who had lived through the Great Depression, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, and decades of social and economic change. They understood both vulnerability and resilience, both the importance of individual responsibility and the necessity of collective action. "We will not change these problems by being more careful or more suspicious," Mrs. Chen continued. "We will change them by building systems that make it harder for bad people to hurt good people, and easier for good people to help each other." The applause that followed her speech was sustained and enthusiastic, but more importantly, it was followed by 3 hours of detailed planning discussion. The seniors in that room had come prepared with specific ideas, concrete proposals, and the kind of practical wisdom that only comes from decades of real-world experience. Ms. Rodriguez suggested establishing a buddy system where seniors would pair up to attend important financial meetings together, providing mutual support and an extra set of eyes to catch potential problems. Dorothy Miller proposed creating a simple checklist that elderly investors could use to evaluate financial advisors and investment opportunities. Frank Thompson, whose wife's Alzheimer's care had been threatened by my father's theft, advocated for developing specialized protections for seniors dealing with cognitive decline and their family caregiver. By the end of the meeting, we had established 5 working committees focused on education, advocacy, oversight, legal reform, and community outreach. Each committee had volunteer leaders, specific goals, and timelines for initial projects. Most importantly, we had created a structure that could sustain itself beyond the initial energy of crisis response. The Education Committee, led by Mrs. Chen and a retired economics professor named Dr. William Martinez, developed a curriculum covering everything from basic investment principles to red flags for financial fraud. Their workshops began meeting weekly at various community centers across Denver, attracting not just seniors but also their adult children who wanted to better understand how to protect their aging parents. The Advocacy Committee, coordinated by Dorothy Miller and a former social worker named Susan Torres, established the buddy system that Mr. Rodriguez had proposed, along with a hotline that seniors could call when they felt pressured or confused by financial sales pitches. The hotline was staffed by trained volunteers who could provide immediate support and connect callers with appropriate professional resources. The Oversight Committee, which Lucas agreed to chair given his forensic accounting background, began compiling data on complaints against financial services providers and identifying patterns that might indicate systematic problems. They worked closely with state regulatory agencies and law enforcement to ensure that concerning patterns were investigated promptly and thoroughly. The Legal Reform Committee, led by Catherine Bell and several other attorneys who volunteered their time, focused on advocating for stronger protections for elderly investors and clearer penalties for financial exploitation. They drafted model legislation that could be introduced at both state and local levels, and they provided expert testimony for regulatory agencies considering new consumer protection rules. The Community Outreach Committee, coordinated by Marcus and a retired public relations professional named Janet Kim, worked to expand awareness of the initiative and recruit additional volunteers. They organized speaker bureaus, developed educational materials, and built partnerships with other organizations serving Denver's senior community. Within 6 months, the Eleanor Hayes Initiative had become a recognized force in Denver's advocacy landscape. The education workshops were drawing waiting lists, the advocacy hotline was fielding dozens of calls each week, and the Oversight Committee had identified and reported several concerning patterns that led to regulatory investigation. But perhaps more importantly, the initiative had created a sense of empowerment and community among Denver's seniors that extended far beyond financial protection. The weekly meetings and volunteer activities had reduced social isolation for many participants, providing opportunities for meaningful engagement and mutual support that had benefits extending well beyond fraud prevention. It's not just about the money, Mrs. Patterson told me during one of the education workshops. It's about feeling like we have some control over our lives, like we don't have to just hope that people will treat us fairly. That sense of agency had been exactly what Mrs. Chen had been hoping to create. She understood that effective fraud prevention required more than just education or oversight. It required fundamentally changing the power dynamic between elderly consumers and the financial services industry. The initiative's first major victory came in the spring, when the Oversight Committee's work led to the prosecution of a financial advisor who had been systematically overcharging elderly clients for unnecessary insurance products. The case bore uncomfortable similarities to my father's crimes, but this time the fraudulent activity had been detected and stopped before it could cause extensive damage. This is what prevention looks like, Detective Rodriguez explained to a reporter covering the case. Instead of waiting for victims to come forward after they've lost their life savings, we now have systems in place to identify problems early and stop them before they escalate. The success brought additional attention and support to the initiative. The Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies provided funding for expanded educational programming. Several Denver area banks and credit unions contributed resources for volunteer training and materials development. The University of Denver's Graduate School of Social Work began offering internship placements with the initiative, providing additional staffing while giving students real-world experience in elder advocacy. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. In June, nearly 2 years after my father's arrest, I received a letter from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Denver field office, informing me that the Eleanor Hayes Initiative had been selected to receive a Community Partnership Award for its contribution to elder fraud prevention. The letter explained that the FBI had been monitoring the initiative's work and had been impressed by both its effectiveness and its innovative approach to community-based prevention. Agent Sarah Collins, who had worked on several elder fraud cases in Colorado, wanted to explore ways that the federal government could support and replicate the initiative's model in other cities. What you've created here represents a new paradigm for fraud prevention, Agent Collins explained during our first meeting at the FBI's downtown Denver office. Most law enforcement approaches are reactive, focused on investigating crimes after they've been committed and victims have been harmed. Your initiative has demonstrated that community-based prevention can actually stop crimes from happening in the first place. The FBI was particularly interested in the Oversight Committee's work, which had developed sophisticated methods for analyzing complaint patterns and identifying potential fraud schemes before they could cause widespread damage. Lucas's forensic accounting expertise had been crucial to this effort, but equally important had been the real-world knowledge of seniors who understood how financial predators typically approached their victims. The combination of professional expertise and lived experience is what makes this so effective, Agent Collins noted. You have people who understand both the technical aspects of financial fraud and the emotional manipulation tactics that make elderly victims vulnerable. The FBI partnership led to the development of a formal training program that could be implemented in other cities, along with a national database for sharing information about financial fraud patterns and prevention strategies. Within a year, similar initiatives had been launched in Phoenix, Salt Lake City, and Albuquerque, each adapted to local conditions, but based on the core principles that Mrs. Chen and our volunteers had developed. The initiative's success had also begun to change my relationship with Denver's broader financial services community. Instead of being known primarily as the daughter of a convicted fraud artist, I was increasingly recognized as someone who had helped create meaningful solutions to industry-wide problems. This shift became evident during the annual conference of the Colorado Association of Financial Planners, where I had been invited to speak about elder fraud prevention. 2 years earlier, I would have expected such an invitation to be motivated primarily by curiosity about my father's crime. Instead, the conference organizers were genuinely interested in learning about prevention strategies they could implement in their own practices. The industry has a reputation problem, admitted David Chen, the association's president, during my pre-conference briefing. High-profile fraud cases like your father's make people suspicious of all financial advisors. Your initiative has shown that we can be part of the solution rather than just defending ourselves against criticism. My presentation focused on practical steps that financial advisors could take to protect elderly clients from exploitation, both by their own firms and by external predators. I discussed the importance of clear communication, family involvement in major financial decisions, and regular check-ins with clients who might be experiencing cognitive decline, but I also challenged the audience to think more broadly about their professional responsibility. Preventing elder financial abuse isn't just about following regulations or avoiding lawsuits, I told the room, full of financial professionals. It's about recognizing that our clients' vulnerability is not a business opportunity, but a call to higher ethical standards. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with dozens of attendees requesting information about how they could support the Eleanor Hayes initiative or implement similar programs in their own community. Several large financial services firms expressed interest in partnering with the initiative to provide funding or professional development opportunities for their staff. This industry engagement was gratifying, but it was Mrs. Chen who reminded me to maintain perspective about our ultimate goal. Professional recognition is nice, she said after I told her about the conference response, but our success should be measured by how many old people sleep better at night, because they feel protected. By that measure, the initiative was clearly succeeding. The advocacy hotline was preventing dozens of fraudulent transactions each month, catching high-pressure sales tactics and suspicious investment opportunities before elderly victims could be harmed. The education workshops had reached more than 2,000 Denver area seniors, providing them with tools and confidence to protect themselves from financial exploitation. Perhaps most importantly, the initiative had created a cultural shift in how Denver's senior community approached financial decision-making. Instead of making important financial choices in isolation, increasingly seniors were involving friends, family members, and trained advocates in their decision-making processes. The shame and embarrassment that had traditionally prevented fraud victims from seeking help was being replaced by a community norm that encouraged transparency and mutual support. This cultural change was evident during the initiative's second annual meeting, held in the gymnasium of a North Denver high school to accommodate the nearly 300 attendees. The gathering included not just seniors and their advocates, but also financial professionals, law enforcement officers, social workers, and family members who had been touched by the initiative's work. Ms. Chen, now 84 and serving as the initiative's honorary president, delivered the keynote address to sustained applause. She spoke about the progress that had been made, but she also challenged the audience to think about unfinished business. "We have proven that community organizing can prevent financial crimes," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the large space. "Now we must prove that we can sustain this work for the long term, that we can train new leaders and expand our reach to protect more people." She was right to focus on sustainability. The initiative's early success had been driven largely by the energy and commitment of people who had been personally affected by my father's crime. But as time passed and the immediate crisis receded from public memory, maintaining momentum would require more systematic approaches to leadership development and resource mobilization. Marcus had been thinking about this challenge as well, and he announced during the meeting that Hayes and Associates would be establishing a permanent endowment to support the initiative's ongoing operation. The endowment would be funded through a percentage of the firm's annual profits, ensuring that the initiative would have reliable financial support regardless of changing political priorities or economic conditions. "This work is too important to depend on temporary grants or volunteer burnout," Marcus explained to the assembled crowd. "We're making a long-term commitment because we believe this model of community-based prevention can protect vulnerable people for generations to come." The endowment announcement was met with enthusiastic applause, but it also prompted important discussions about the initiative's governance and independence. Some attendees worried that too close a relationship with Hayes and Associates might compromise the initiative's ability to critique the financial services industry or advocate for regulatory changes that could affect Marcus's business. These concerns led to the establishment of an independent board of directors for the initiative, with representation from seniors, advocacy organizations, legal professionals, and community members who had no financial stake in the financial services industry. The board would oversee the initiative's strategic direction and ensure that its advocacy remained focused on protecting seniors rather than advancing any particular business interests. Lucas agreed to serve on the initial board, bringing his forensic accounting expertise while maintaining independence from Hayes and Associates. Mrs. Chen accepted the position of board chair, a role that would allow her to continue shaping the initiative's direction while beginning to train younger leaders who could eventually take over her responsibilities. The board's first major decision was to expand the initiative's geographic reach beyond Denver, working with similar organizations in other Colorado cities to create a statewide network for elder financial protection. This expansion would require significant additional resources and coordination, but it would also create opportunities for sharing best practices in developing more sophisticated prevention strategies. By the third anniversary of my father's arrest, the Eleanor Hayes Initiative had become a nationally recognized model for community-based elder fraud prevention. The program had been replicated in more than 20 cities across the country, and the FBI had incorporated many of the initiative's strategies into its national elder fraud prevention guidelines. But for me, the most meaningful measure of success remained the individual stories of protection and empowerment that emerged from the initiative's daily work. Letters from seniors who had avoided fraudulent investment schemes because of education workshop training. Thank you notes from family members whose elderly parents had been protected by advocacy volunteers. Reports from law enforcement agencies about fraud schemes that had been detected and stopped before they could cause widespread harm. Each of these stories represented a life preserved from the kind of devastation that my father had inflicted on his victims. Each represented a family that would not have to experience the betrayal and loss that had defined so much of our family's recent history. Standing in our back garden on a warm September evening, watching Lucas tend to the tomato plants we'd grown from seeds that Mrs. Chan had given us, I reflected on how much had changed since that October morning, when she had appeared at our door with a casserole dish and a plan to transform how our community protected its most vulnerable members. The initiative had grown far beyond anything we had originally envisioned, but its core mission remained exactly what Mrs. Chen had articulated during that first meeting: building systems that made it harder for bad people to hurt good people and easier for good people to help each other. The work was far from finished. Financial predators continued to develop new schemes, and Denver's senior population continued to grow as baby boomers aged into retirement. But we had proven that community organizing could be an effective tool for prevention, and we had built institutions that could sustain this work for decades to come. Most importantly, we had honored my grandmother Eleanor's memory by creating something that reflected her values and her commitment to community service. The initiative bore her name, but it embodied her belief that ordinary people working together could solve problems that seemed too large for individual action. As Lucas and I sat on our back porch that evening, sharing a dinner of vegetables from our garden and reflecting on the day's successes and challenges, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the direction our lives had taken. We had transformed a story of family betrayal and criminal exploitation into a narrative of community empowerment and systematic change. The road ahead would continue to present challenges and opportunities for growth, but we had built something solid, something that could endure beyond our own involvement, something that would continue protecting vulnerable people long after we were gone. In the end, that seemed like the most appropriate legacy for the Hayes family name, and the most fitting tribute to a grandmother who had understood that true wealth came not from what you accumulated for yourself, but from what you contributed to the well-being of others. The challenge to everything we had built came from an unexpected direction on a cold February morning, when Marcus burst into my home office, his usually composed demeanor replaced by visible agitation. He was holding his laptop in one hand and his phone in the other, both devices displaying what appeared to be the same alarming news story. "We have a problem," he announced, setting the laptop on my desk so I could see the headline that had clearly shaken him. "Financial advisor uses charity work to target new victims, Eleanor Hayes initiative under investigation." The article, published by a Denver business magazine known for aggressive investigative reporting, alleged that several financial advisors had been using their association with our elder protection initiative to gain credibility with potential clients, then exploiting that trust to sell inappropriate investment products to vulnerable seniors. The reporter claimed to have documented multiple instances where seniors had been told that their financial advisor was approved by the Eleanor Hayes initiative as a way to overcome their resistance to risky investment strategy. I read through the article twice, my stomach sinking with each paragraph. The accusations were sophisticated and damaging, suggesting that our initiative had become a tool for exactly the kind of exploitation we had been created to prevent. Even worse, the article questioned whether Marcus and I had been aware of this misuse of our organization's reputation and had failed to take action to stop it. "How long have you known about this?" I asked, looking up at Marcus, who was pacing behind my chair with the nervous energy of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "I didn't know about it at all until this morning," he replied, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "The first call came from Janet Kim at 6:30. She was crying, saying that reporters had been calling her since yesterday asking about our approval process for financial advisors. We don't have an approval process. We've never endorsed specific advisors." The implications were staggering. If financial predators were using our initiative's reputation to exploit elderly victims, we were not just failing in our mission, but actively contributing to the harm we had been created to prevent. The irony was bitter and devastating. The organization we had built to honor my grandmother's memory and protect seniors from exploitation like my father's was now being weaponized by other criminals pursuing similar goals. Marcus showed me his phone, which displayed a series of increasingly urgent text messages from Mrs. Chen, Catherine Bell, Lucas, and other key supporters of the initiative. Everyone was demanding explanations, asking for emergency meetings, and expressing concerns about the damage this scandal could do to our credibility and effectiveness. The most painful message was from Mrs. Chen, whose usual confident tone had been replaced by something approaching desperation. "Victoria, people are calling me asking if they can trust the initiative anymore. I don't know what to tell them. We need to mediate." I closed my laptop and reached for my coat, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether the initiative could survive this crisis, or whether 3 years of community building would collapse under the weight of accusations that we had enabled the very crimes we claimed to oppose. The emergency meeting convened at the Montclair Recreation Center within 2 hours of the article's publication. The community room that had hosted so many hopeful planning sessions and celebration gatherings now felt heavy with tension and uncertainty. Mrs. Chen sat at the front table with her characteristic dignity intact, but I could see worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there the previous week. Lucas had arrived before me and was already deep in conversation with Detective Rodriguez, who had been monitoring the situation since early morning. Catherine Bell was reviewing legal documents with several other attorneys who volunteered with the initiative, their expressions grave as they discussed potential liability issues and response strategy. "Tell me exactly what we're dealing with," I said, taking my place at the front table beside Mrs. Chen, who reached over to squeeze my hand in a gesture of solidarity that I desperately needed. Detective Rodriguez opened a manila folder thick with complaint reports and investigation summary. "We've identified at least 6 different financial advisors who have been falsely claiming association with your initiative over the past 8 months. They approach seniors who have attended your workshops or heard about your program through community networks, then represent themselves as approved or recommended by the Eleanor Hayes Initiative." The details were infuriating and heartbreaking. One advisor had convinced an 80-year-old widow to invest her late husband's life insurance proceeds in a high-risk real estate venture by claiming that the Eleanor Hayes Initiative had thoroughly vetted his company's track record. Another had persuaded a retired teacher to transfer his pension funds to a cryptocurrency trading platform by suggesting that our initiative's oversight committee had approved digital currency investments for seniors. The common pattern is that they use your initiative's reputation to overcome seniors' natural skepticism about risky investments. Detective Rodriguez continued, "They're essentially exploiting the trust that you've built in the community to commit the same kinds of crimes that Robert Hayes was convicted for." The comparison to my father's methods was particularly painful because it was entirely accurate. These predators were using the same psychological manipulation tactics that my father had employed, leveraging community trust and family connections to exploit vulnerable people. The only difference was that instead of using my grandmother Eleanor's reputation directly, they were using the reputation of the organization we had created in her memory. Miss Chen spoke for the first time since I had arrived, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of steel that I had learned to recognize as her preparation for battle. "How many people have been hurt?" Detective Rodriguez consulted his notes. "We've confirmed financial losses totaling approximately $350,000 across 14 victims, but we suspect there may be additional cases that haven't been reported yet." The number hit me like a physical blow. $350,000 stolen from elderly victims who had trusted financial advisors partly because of their false association with our initiative. We had created an organization to prevent exactly this kind of harm, and now we were discovering that our own reputation was being used as a tool for exploitation. "What are our legal obligations here?" Marcus asked Catherine Bell, who had been furiously taking notes throughout Detective Rodriguez's presentation. Catherine looked up from her legal pad with an expression that suggested the answer was complicated and not entirely favorable. "Legally, the initiative probably isn't liable for damages caused by people falsely claiming association with us. Assuming we can demonstrate that we had no knowledge of their activities and took reasonable steps to prevent misuse of our name." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But our moral obligations are much more extensive. We've built our reputation on protecting seniors from financial exploitation. If we allow that reputation to be used as a tool for exploitation, we're failing in our fundamental mission regardless of our legal liability." The room fell silent as the implications of her assessment settled over everyone present. We could probably protect ourselves legally, but doing so would require abandoning the broader responsibility we had accepted when we decided to become advocates for vulnerable seniors. Lucas broke the silence with a question that cut to the heart of our dilemma. What would Eleanor have done? Mrs. Chen smiled slightly at the question, the first time I had seen her expression lighten since arriving at the meeting. Eleanor would have asked 2 questions. How do we help the people who have been hurt? And how do we prevent this from happening to anyone else? Those questions became the framework for our response strategy. Instead of focusing primarily on protecting the initiative's reputation or minimizing our legal exposure, we would concentrate on taking responsibility for the harm that had been done and implementing systems to prevent future misuse of our name and mission. The decision was not unanimous. Several board members and volunteers argued that taking responsibility for crimes committed by people with no actual connection to our organization was both unfair and potentially dangerous from a legal perspective. They worried that accepting blame for these incidents would open us to lawsuits and regulatory scrutiny that could destroy everything we had built. But Mrs. Chen's moral clarity proved persuasive to the majority of our support. We cannot build trust by avoiding responsibility, she argued during the heated discussion that followed our initial planning session. We can only build trust by demonstrating that we care more about protecting people than protecting ourselves. Our response began with immediate outreach to every confirmed victim of the fraudulent advisors. I personally called each person who had been harmed, explaining the situation honestly and offering both apologies and assistance. These conversations were among the most difficult I had ever experienced, requiring me to acknowledge that an organization I had helped create to prevent elder fraud had inadvertently contributed to exactly that kind of harm. Mrs. Patterson, who had lost $12,000 to a fake cryptocurrency scheme, was gracious but devastated. "I thought I was being careful," she told me during our phone conversation, her voice shaking with emotion. "I thought I was making smart choices by working with someone the Eleanor Hayes initiative had approved." Her words captured the essence of our failure. We had built an organization that encouraged seniors to trust their own judgment and rely on community support, but we had not adequately protected that trust from exploitation by criminals who understood how to manipulate it. The hardest conversation was with Frank Thompson, whose wife's Alzheimer's care funding had been jeopardized by another fraudulent investment scheme. Frank had been one of our strongest supporters, speaking publicly about how the initiative had helped him feel confident about financial decisions during an incredibly stressful period of his life. "I don't blame you personally," Frank told me when I called to explain what had happened, "but I trusted someone because I thought you had vouched for them. That's on me for not asking more questions, but it's also on you for not making it clearer how people should verify claims about your organization's endorsement." His analysis was exactly right, and it pointed toward the systematic changes we would need to implement to prevent future exploitation of our reputation. We had built strong educational and advocacy programs, but we had not created adequate safeguards against the misuse of our organization's credibility. The initiative's board met in emergency session for 3 consecutive days to develop a comprehensive response plan. The plan included immediate restitution for confirmed victims, new verification systems to prevent false claims of association with our organization, expanded educational programs to help seniors identify fraudulent endorsement, and enhanced cooperation with law enforcement to pursue prosecution of the financial advisors who had exploited our reputation. The restitution component was the most straightforward but also the most expensive. Using a combination of initiative reserves, emergency contributions from board members, and a special fundraising campaign, we committed to providing full compensation to every confirmed victim of advisors who had falsely claimed association with our organization. Marcus and Hayes and Associates contributed the largest single amount, nearly $100,000, that represented a significant portion of the firm's annual profit. "This is exactly why we established the endowment," Marcus explained to a reporter who questioned whether his contribution created conflicts of interest for the initiative. "We committed to supporting this work for the long term, including taking responsibility when things go wrong." The verification systems required more complex implementation. We developed a formal certification process for financial professionals who wanted to demonstrate their commitment to elder protection principles, along with a public database that seniors could use to verify whether someone was actually affiliated with our organization. The certification process included background checks, ethics training, ongoing education requirements, and regular audits of business practice. Certified professionals would be authorized to display the Eleanor Hayes Initiative seal and would be listed in our public database, but they would also be subject to ongoing oversight and could lose their certification if complaints or audits revealed problematic practices. Most importantly, we launched an extensive public education campaign to help seniors understand the difference between someone who was certified by our initiative and someone who merely claimed association with our work. The campaign included new workshop components, updated educational materials, and a simple verification protocol that seniors could use when encountering anyone who claimed to be connected with our organization. If someone says they're approved by the Eleanor Hayes Initiative, ask to see their certification number and verify it on our website, became the key message we promoted throughout Denver's senior community. If they can't provide a certification number or if they discourage you from verifying their claims, that's a red flag that should make you immediately suspicious. The enhanced law enforcement cooperation involved working closely with Detective Rodriguez and other agencies to identify and prosecute the financial advisors who had exploited our reputation. This effort was complicated by the fact that many of the fraudulent practices involved misleading marketing rather than outright theft, making prosecution challenging under existing law. However, our cooperation helped law enforcement build stronger cases by documenting the pattern of deception and demonstrating how the false claims of association with our initiative were central to the advisor's ability to overcome seniors' resistance to risky investment. 3 of the 6 identified advisors were eventually charged with fraud, while the others faced civil penalties and professional sanctions that ended their ability to work with elderly clients. The crisis management process took nearly 6 months to complete, during which time the initiative's reputation remained under intense scrutiny from both media and regulatory agencies. We faced questions about our oversight procedures, our verification systems, and our overall effectiveness as a fraud prevention organization. The scrutiny was painful but ultimately beneficial. It forced us to examine every aspect of our operations and to implement improvements that made us significantly more effective at preventing the misuse of our reputation and mission. More importantly, it demonstrated to the community that we were willing to accept responsibility for our failures and to make substantial changes to prevent similar problems in the future. The initiative's credibility began to recover when the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies issued a report praising our response to the crisis and recommending that other consumer protection organizations adopt similar accountability measures. The report specifically noted that our willingness to provide full restitution to victims and to implement systematic safeguards had set a new standard for organizational responsibility in the nonprofit sector. The Eleanor Hayes Initiative's response to this crisis demonstrates the kind of institutional integrity that builds lasting trust with vulnerable populations, the report concluded. Their approach should serve as a model for other organizations working to protect seniors from financial exploitation. Media coverage gradually shifted from criticism of our failures to recognition of our accountability and reform efforts.
A follow-up article in the same business magazine that had initially exposed the problem acknowledged that our response had been unprecedented in its scope and sincerity, and that we had transformed a significant organizational failure into an opportunity for meaningful improvement. But the most important validation came from the seniors we served. Mrs. organized a community meeting 6 months after the crisis began, inviting everyone who had been affected by the fraudulent advisors to share their thoughts about the initiative's response and their confidence in our ongoing work. The meeting was held in the same gymnasium where we had celebrated the initiative's 2nd anniversary, but the mood was very different. Instead of celebration, there was a sense of testing, of evaluation, of people deciding whether to continue trusting an organization that had let them down. Miss Patterson spoke first, representing the group of seniors who had lost money to the fraudulent advisors. "What happened to us was terrible," she acknowledged, "but how the initiative responded showed us what this organization is really made of. They didn't make excuses, they didn't blame us for being trusting, and they didn't hide behind lawyers. They took responsibility and they made it right." Frank Thompson, whose criticism had been particularly pointed during the crisis,
offered a more nuanced assessment. Trust isn't about never making mistakes, he said. Trust is about how you handle things when mistakes happen. The Eleanor Hayes initiative made serious mistakes, but they handled them in a way that actually made me more confident in their integrity. The meeting included difficult conversations about the initiative's failures and the harm that had been caused by our inadequate safeguards. But it also included expressions of renewed support and confidence that reflected the community's appreciation for our accountability and reform effort. By the end of the evening, it was clear that the initiative had not just survived the crisis, but had emerged stronger and more trusted than before. We had demonstrated that our commitment to protecting seniors extended to taking responsibility for our own failures and implementing meaningful changes to prevent future harm. The crisis also led to unexpected opportunities for growth and expansion. Other cities that had been considering implementing similar initiatives reached out to learn about our crisis response and reform measures. The National Association of Consumer Protection Agencies invited us to present our accountability model at their annual conference. The Federal Trade Commission asked us to consult on new guidelines for nonprofit organizations working with vulnerable populations. Perhaps most significantly, several major financial services companies approached us about developing industry-wide standards for ethical marketing to seniors, using our certification program as a foundation for broader professional accountability measures. These conversations led to the creation of the National Elder Financial Protection Standards, a voluntary certification program that was eventually adopted by financial advisors in more than 30 states. The crisis had cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars, months of intensive work, and significant damage to our reputation. But it had also forced us to become a more sophisticated and effective organization, one that was better equipped to prevent the very problems that had initially compromised our mission. Standing in the same community room where Ms. Chin had first outlined her vision for elder financial protection, now decorated with certificates recognizing our accountability efforts and letters of support from satisfied participants, I reflected on how much we had learned about the complexity of building trust with vulnerable populations. The work of protecting seniors from financial exploitation required more than good intentions and community organizing. It required systematic thinking about how trust could be built, maintained, and protected from those who would exploit. It required ongoing vigilance about our own potential failures and a willingness to accept responsibility when those failures caused harm. Most importantly, it required understanding that credibility with vulnerable populations was not something that could be achieved once and then taken for granted. It was something that had to be earned continuously, through consistent ethical behavior and transparent accountability when mistakes occurred. The initiative had survived its greatest test and had become stronger as a result. But we had also learned that the work of building and maintaining trust was never finished, and that the price of effectiveness in protecting vulnerable people was eternal vigilance about our own potential to cause harm. Lucas found me in the empty community room after the evening's meeting had concluded, everyone else having departed for home with renewed confidence in the initiative's future. He wrapped his arms around me from behind and I leaned into his familiar warmth, finally allowing myself to feel the exhaustion that 6 months of crisis management had created. "You did it," he said quietly. "You saved something that was worth saving." I thought about his words as we walked home through the quiet Denver streets, past the houses where many of our program participants lived, past the community centers where our workshops continued to, past the landmarks of a city where the Eleanor Hayes initiative had become synonymous with integrity and accountability rather than just good intentions. We had done more than save an organization. We had proven that it was possible to build trust with vulnerable people and to maintain that trust even when serious mistakes occur. We had demonstrated that accountability was not a weakness but a source of strength, and that taking responsibility for failures was the foundation of lasting credibility. The road ahead would continue to present challenges and opportunities for both growth and failures. But we had built something resilient, something that could survive crisis and emerge stronger, something that honored my grandmother Eleanor's legacy while adapting to the complex realities of modern elder protection work. In the end, that seemed like the most valuable lesson we could have learned, that building something lasting required not just vision and dedication but also the humility to acknowledge mistakes and the courage to transform failures into opportunities for meaningful improvement. 5 years after that January morning when my father walked into Marcus's office believing he was about to destroy my career, I stood in the gleaming lobby of the newly constructed Eleanor Hayes Community Protection Center, watching a steady stream of seniors arrive for the monthly advisory council meeting. The building itself represented everything we had accomplished and everything we still hope to achieve. Modern but welcoming, sophisticated but accessible, designed specifically to serve the needs of Denver's elderly community while projecting the dignity and respect they deserve. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a reception area where volunteers greeted visitors with genuine warmth rather than institutional politeness. Miss Chen, now 87 and moving more slowly but with undiminished authority, held court near the information desk, surrounded by newer volunteers who sought her guidance on everything from workshop curriculum to advocacy strategy. Lucas emerged from the elevator carrying a stack of quarterly reports, his role as the center's executive director having evolved naturally from his initial involvement with the Oversight Committee. His forensic accounting background had proven invaluable not just for fraud detection, but for building the transparent financial management systems that had become a model for nonprofit organizations throughout Colorado. "The Colorado Springs team called this morning," he said, joining me near the windows that overlooked downtown Denver's financial district. "They want to discuss expanding the mobile outreach program to cover rural communities in El Paso County." The mobile outreach program represented one of our most successful innovations, bringing financial education and advocacy services directly to seniors who couldn't easily travel to workshop locations. Custom-equipped vehicles staffed by trained volunteers visited senior housing facilities, community centers, and even private homes, providing personalized assistance with everything from Medicare fraud prevention to investment scam identification. The program had grown from a single van serving Denver's metropolitan area to a fleet of 12 vehicles covering most of Colorado, with additional programs launching in 4 other states. The success had attracted attention from federal agencies, leading to a partnership with the Department of Health and Human Services that provided funding for national expansion. "Tell them we can have a planning team there next month," I replied, watching as Marcus's newest hire, a recent graduate from the University of Denver's social work program, guided a group of seniors through the center's interactive fraud prevention exhibit. The exhibit used realistic scenarios and hands-on activities to help visitors recognize and respond to common scam tactics, from phone calls claiming urgent medical billing problems to door-to-door salespeople offering home security systems. The approach had proven far more effective than traditional educational lectures, allowing seniors to practice their responses in a safe environment before encountering real fraud attempts. Marcus appeared beside us, having just concluded a meeting with representatives from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who were discussing the latest developments in cryptocurrency fraud targeting elderly investors. At 33, he had become one of the most respected voices in elder financial protection, frequently consulted by policymakers and law enforcement agencies, developing new approaches to fraud prevention. "The FBI wants to fund a specialized training program for rural law enforcement," he reported. "They're seeing more sophisticated scams in small towns where local police don't have experience with financial crimes investigation." The request reflected the initiative's evolution from a local response to my father's crimes into a nationally recognized resource for communities struggling with elder financial exploitation. Our training programs had been implemented in more than 200 cities, our educational materials had been translated into 8 languages, and our accountability standards had been adopted by nonprofit organizations serving vulnerable populations across multiple sectors. But perhaps more importantly, we had maintained the community-centered approach that Mrs. Chen had insisted upon from the beginning. Despite our growth and national recognition, the heart of our work remained the relationships between individual volunteers and the seniors they served. the personal connections that made abstract principles meaningful in real-world situations. The monthly advisory council meeting brought together representatives from all of our program areas to discuss challenges, share successes, and provide input on strategic decisions. The council included seniors who had been with us since the beginning, newer participants who brought fresh perspectives, family members of fraud victims, and professionals from related fields who contributed specialized expertise. Today's agenda focused on our response to artificial intelligence-enabled fraud schemes, a rapidly evolving threat that was creating new vulnerabilities for elderly internet users. Scammers were using AI technology to create convincing fake videos of family members requesting emergency financial assistance, to generate realistic but fraudulent investment websites, and to automate phone calls that could adapt their scripts based on victims' responses. Mrs. Chen opened the meeting with characteristic directness. Technology changes, but human nature does not. These new scams work because they exploit the same emotions that have always made people vulnerable: fear, loneliness, desire to help family members, hope for financial security. Her analysis guided our discussion toward solutions that addressed both the technical and emotional aspects of AI-enabled fraud. We would need to update our educational materials to include information about deepfake videos and voice cloning, but we would also need to strengthen the social connections that made seniors less susceptible to isolation-based manipulation. The best defense against loneliness-based scams is not being lonely, observed Dorothy Miller, who at 85 continued to coordinate our peer support network. When people have regular contact with friends and family, they're more likely to verify suspicious communications before responding to them. The insight led to renewed emphasis on the community-building aspects of our work. While fraud prevention remained our primary mission, we had learned that effective protection required addressing the social isolation that made elderly people attractive targets for financial predators. Our volunteer coordinator, Janet, reported that the peer support network now included more than 800 active participants across Colorado, with buddy relationships that extended far beyond financial protection into companionship, shared activities, and mutual assistance with daily challenges. Last month, our volunteers helped prevent 14 confirmed fraud attempts, Janet reported, but they also provided transportation to medical appointments, helped with grocery shopping during illness, and offered emotional support during family crises. The fraud prevention is important, but the community connection is what makes it sustainable. The meeting continued for nearly 3 hours, with detailed discussions of program evaluation data, funding strategies, partnership opportunities, and policy advocacy priority. The depth and sophistication of the conversation reflected how much our organization had matured since Mrs. Chen's initial vision of community-based elder protection. When the formal meeting concluded, I found myself in conversation with several participants who had become friends as well as colleagues over the years of working together. Frank Thompson, whose wife's Alzheimer's care had been threatened by my father's theft, reported that his new marriage to Dorothy Miller was providing both of them with the companionship and mutual support that enhanced their resilience against fraud attempts. Finding love at 83 wasn't something I expected, Frank said with a smile that transformed his weathered face. But Dorothy and I discovered that we could protect each other better than either of us could protect ourselves alone. Their relationship had become a model for the kind of mutual support that the initiative tried to foster throughout Denver's senior community. They attended financial planning workshops together, verified each other's investment decisions, and provided the emotional security that made them less vulnerable to manipulation-based scams. As the afternoon wore on, and participants gradually departed for home, I found myself alone in the center's memorial garden, a quiet space dedicated to seniors who had been victims of financial fraud before our initiative existed. The garden included a bronze plaque honoring my grandmother Eleanor, along with smaller markers recognizing other community members whose experiences had contributed to our understanding of elder financial protection. My father's name was not memorialized anywhere in the center, a deliberate choice that had required careful consideration. While his crimes had catalyzed the creation of our organization, we had decided that honoring the initiative's purpose required focusing on the victims and heroes rather than the perpetrators. I thought about my father occasionally, particularly when reviewing reports of new fraud schemes that echoed his method. He had been released from federal prison after serving 8 years of his 10-year sentence, his early release granted in recognition of his participation in educational programs designed to help other inmates understand the impact of financial crimes on victims. Detective Rodriguez had informed me of his release several months earlier, along with the requirement that he complete 2 years of supervised probation with restrictions on his access to financial services and elderly clients. He was living in a halfway house in Colorado Springs, working as a janitor for a nonprofit organization that provided services to homeless veterans. The restrictions meant that our paths were unlikely to cross, and I had no desire to initiate contact. Too much had happened, too many people had been hurt, and too much work remained to be done for me to spend emotional energy on rebuilding a relationship that had been fundamentally damaged by his crimes and my necessary response to them. My mother Patricia had moved to Phoenix to be closer to my cousin Emma, whose 30th birthday had finally triggered the distribution of the remaining trust fund. Patricia and I maintained cordial but distant communication, exchanging holiday cards and occasional phone calls that carefully avoided discussion of my father or the initiative's work. My brother Daniel had built a successful law practice in California, specializing in corporate defense work that kept him far from the world of elder advocacy and financial crime prevention. We had not spoken in more than 2 years, a silence that felt permanent rather than temporary. The losses were real and lasting, but they were also the price of choosing accountability over family loyalty, of protecting vulnerable strangers over maintaining comfortable relationships with people who preferred denial to truth. As the sun began to set over the mountains west of Denver, casting long shadows across the Memorial Garden, Lucas found me sitting on the bench where I often came to reflect on the journey that had brought us to this point. "Thinking about the old day?" he asked, settling beside me with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had shared every significant moment of the past 5 years. "Thinking about choices," I replied, reaching for his hand, "about all the different ways this story could have ended. We could have chosen to handle my father's crimes privately, arranging quiet restitution without public exposure or legal prosecution. We could have prioritized family relationships over justice for his victim. We could have built a smaller, safer organization that avoided the risks and responsibilities that came with rapid growth and national recognition. Instead, we had chosen the harder path that led to accountability, transparency, and systematic change. The choice had cost us relationships and created ongoing obligations that would last for decades, but it had also created something lasting and meaningful that protected vulnerable people and honored values that transcended family loyalty." Marcus joined us in the garden as the streetlights began to flicker on throughout the downtown area. At 33, he had accomplished more in business and community service than most people achieved in entire careers, but he carried his success with the same quiet integrity that had made our initial plan possible. "The board approved the national expansion proposal," he reported, referring to an ambitious 5-year plan that would establish Eleanor Hayes community protection centers in 50 additional cities. "The funding is in place, the training protocols are finalized, and we have commitments from local partners in 37 cities. The expansion represented the culmination of everything we had built since Mrs. Chen had appeared at our door with her vision of community-based elder protection. Within 5 years, hundreds of thousands of seniors across the country would have access to the educational advocacy and support services that had grown from our response to my father's crime. Eleanor would be proud," I said, thinking about my grandmother's belief that individual kindness could create systematic change when channeled through organized community action. "She'd probably have suggestions for improvement," Marcus replied with a smile. Grandma Eleanor never met a good idea that couldn't be made better with more work and higher standards. We sat in comfortable silence as the city settled into evening around us, watching the lights come on in office buildings where people were finishing their workday, in apartment buildings where families were gathering for dinner, in the senior housing facilities where many of our program participants lived with the security that came from knowing their community was actively working to protect them. The initiative had become larger and more complex than any of us had originally envisioned, but its core mission remained exactly what Mrs. Chen had articulated during that first meeting, building systems that made it harder for bad people to hurt good people, and easier for good people to help each other. The work would continue long after all of us were gone, carried forward by new generations of volunteers and advocates who understood that protecting vulnerable people required both individual compassion and systematic change. The infrastructure was in place, the training protocols were proven, and the community relationships were strong enough to sustain the mission indefinitely. Most importantly, we had demonstrated that it was possible to transform a story of family betrayal and criminal exploitation into a narrative of accountability, healing, and positive change. The transformation hadn't erased the original harm or eliminated the ongoing pain of broken relationships, but it had created something meaningful from tragedy and built lasting protection for people who needed it. As we walked home through the quiet streets of Capitol Hill, past the houses where this journey had begun, and the community centers where it had taken root, I felt a deep sense of completion about the path we had chosen. The road ahead would continue to present challenges and opportunities, but we had built something solid, something that would endure, something that honored both my grandmother's values and the victims who had trusted us to transform their suffering into protection for others. The story that had begun with my father's attempt to destroy my career by falsely reporting embezzlement to my son had become a story about the power of accountability, the possibility of redemption through service, and the ability of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they chose truth over comfort and justice over convenience. In the end, that seemed like the most fitting conclusion to a narrative that had started with deception and betrayal but had grown into something honest, transparent, and genuinely protective of the people who needed protection most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.